All right, you guys, so we're going to derive the quadratic formula, and we're going to complete the square of the general form of a quadratic equation that's in standard form that we have right here. Now, we did this in class where we completed the square of the general form of a quadratic expression that was in standard form, but now it's for an equation. So just like with the expression, we first want to factor out this leading coefficient of a. So when I factor out the a, I'm essentially dividing each of these terms by a. So we'll have x squared in the brackets plus b over a x. And I'm going to leave some space. I think you guys remember why. And we'll have plus c over a, close my brackets, equals to 0. Okay, so now I'm going to take the coefficient of this second term that's inside the brackets, and I'm going to divide by 2. So I'm going to add b over 2a squared and subtract b over 2a squared. Now remember, when I do that, I'm essentially adding 0 to the left-hand side of the equation. If you remember the properties of real numbers, if I add 0 to a number, it's equal to itself. So I can add 0 here, and the left-hand side is still equal to what it was before. It's going to be equal to 0. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's group these first 3 terms that are inside the bracket together. Okay, and if you remember, this is going to be a perfect square trinomial. And we're going to factor that perfect square trinomial to be x plus b over 2a. So I have the a still outside of the brackets, and x plus b over 2a squared. And I'm going to simplify the b over 2a squared to be minus b squared over 4a squared. And I still have the plus c over a, close brackets, equals to 0. Okay, so we've completed the square inside the brackets now. And once we've done that, now we want to distribute this a. So we'll have a times x plus b over 2a squared. When I distribute the a to the minus b squared over 4a squared, this a will end up canceling with one of the a's that's in the denominator. So minus b squared over 4a. And then when we distribute the a to the c over a, that will just be c. So if you remember from solving quadratic equations by completing the square, we ended up having to switch to the square root method, where we first wanted to isolate this perfect square before we could take the square root of both sides of the equation. So let's isolate that perfect square by adding b squared over 4a and subtracting c. So on the left-hand side, we will now have a times x plus b over 2a squared equals to b squared over 4a minus c. Okay, let's get a common denominator on the right-hand side. So my common denominator is going to be 4a, so I'm going to multiply the minus c by 4a in the numerator and denominator. Ax plus b over 2a squared. And now on the right-hand side, we're going to have b squared minus 4ac over 4a. And those of you who know the quadratic formula already, you're starting to see that take shape, that b squared minus 4ac. Okay, so we still have this a being multiplied by the perfect square. So let's divide by a on both sides of the equation, property of equality. So x plus b over 2a squared is equal to the b squared minus 4ac now over 4ac. No, not c. A squared. That was silly. A squared. Okay, so now we have our perfect square on the left-hand side isolated. So let's take the square root of both sides of the equation. X plus b over 2a equals 2 plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. Okay, we're getting close. Oh, I forgot my square root. Now we're getting close. Now, if you remember the properties of radicals, the square root of a fraction is equal to the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. So let's show that. So we'll have x plus b over 2a equals 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And when I take the square root of the denominator, 4 times a squared is a product. The square root of 4 is 2. And the square root of a squared is going to be a. So now if we subtract b over 2a, we get x is equal to minus b over 2a. I'm going to put that in front. If you remember square root method, when we added or subtracted the constant, then we put that in front of the plus or minus. So the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay. Almost there. So notice that we have a common denominator here. So I can rewrite the right-hand side of the equation as x is equal to, I'm going to put the negative with the numerator, so minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4a times c, and then put that all over 2a. And voila, we have our quadratic formula. Okay, and we're going to use our quadratic formula to help us solve quadratic equations. And the cool thing about the quadratic formula is that it can help you find the roots to any quadratic equation that you're given. So up to now we've been using factoring, complete the square method, square root method, but remember that square root method and factoring, unfortunately, do not work for necessarily every quadratic equation, to solve every quadratic equation, but to complete the square method and the quadratic formula do.